Even before the outbreak of war, prominent Americans often spoke of an obligation to serve as a model of peaceful capitalist progress. For nearly 2 decades, the U.S. had policed the Western Hemisphere to prevent instability that might provoke European meddling. U.S. investments in Latin American mines, railroads, and plantations were a source of enormous profit. In addition, they were seen as a way to uplift and civilize what were often described as, quote, backward races. To distinguish these actions from that of other imperialist nations, Congress took pride in passage of the two Jones Acts of 1916 and 1917 that conferred partial rights of citizenship on the people of the Philippines and Puerto Rico, which the nation had seized from Spain in 1898. Most Americans interpreted the war in Europe and U.S. detachment as proof of their own good sense in contrast to other people's violent passions. President Woodrow Wilson reacted to the outbreak of fighting by issuing a neutrality declaration that called on Americans to stay neutral in thought as well as in deed. Although Wilson admired Great Britain's democratic system, he considered all the warring nations partly at fault for their greed, competing alliances, and aggressive nationalism. He particularly detested Germany's militaristic stance and its efforts to acquire new territories, which posed a threat to American interest in the Caribbean and Latin America. Americans harbored a wide range of sentiment toward the warring powers. Most wealthy industrialists and bankers traced their heritage to the British Isles. Many elite families had married their daughters to the sons of English aristocrats in a bid to boost their own social standing. As a sign of solidarity and with government approval, major New York banks loaned nearly $2.5 billion, worth about $50 billion in today's dollars, to the British and French during the first 2.5 years of the war. At the other end of the social spectrum, Irish, German, Polish, and Eastern European Jewish immigrants scoffed at the Allies' democratic credentials. For decades, the Irish had fled hunger and oppressive British rule in their homeland. German immigrants who flocked to the U.S. in the 19th century, often in a quest for greater freedom, felt little kinship with Kaiser Wilhelm's strutting militarism, but they resented Allied propaganda depicting their culture and homeland as brutal and savage. The Jews who came in growing numbers to the U.S. after the 1880s had fled anti-Semitic policies of Imperial Russia, which also ruled much of Poland. Nevertheless, President Woodrow Wilson, along with most business leaders, believed that American security and prosperity required maintaining close ties to the British and French. Since the Civil War, the export of grain, cotton, and minerals to Western Europe and British investments in the U.S. had provided the capital to spur economic growth. If the war in Europe stopped exports, the U.S. would suffer immense harm. Factory owners and mill workers, prosperous farmers, and tenant sharecroppers would all be hurt if the war closed down the Atlantic sea lanes. Appealing to both international law and self-interest, Wilson spoke for Americans when he insisted that a neutral U.S. had the right to export non-military goods to all the warring powers and to have its own citizens travel on passenger ships, including those owned by belligerent or warring nations. The country had no right to sell so-called contraband items such as guns or munitions to any of the belligerents, but the president believed it had every right to sell raw materials and non-military products. At the start of the Great War, international law specified that when a naval vessel encountered an unarmed enemy cargo or passenger ship, it should be stopped, boarded, and its crew and passengers offloaded before it was sunk or seized. But the submarine, or U-boat, a new weapon in the German arsenal, was effective only if it attacked without warning. A U-boat that surfaced to identify or board a cargo ship could easily be rammed or sunk by small arms fire. Britain's Royal Navy dominated the Atlantic Ocean from the time the war began. After eliminating German cargo ships, the Royal Navy imposed a blockade against all neutral shipping bound for German-controlled ports in Europe. British warships either turned back or impounded cargo carried by neutral merchant ships, including U.S. vessels attempting to deliver food or raw materials to Germany. This step made it impossible for Germany to import either food or raw materials, some of it bound for civilians as well as for war use, from neutrals like the US. Germany retaliated by declaring the waters around Britain and France a war zone and threatened to attack any ship, Allied or neutral, in the area. Wilson condemned British interference with US merchant ships bound for German ports, but since the blockade did not kill Americans or destroy their property, the violations of international law elicited diplomatic protests, not threats of violent retaliation. In contrast, Germany's seemingly indiscriminate use of submarines to attack merchant ships shocked most Americans. In May 1915, a U-boat torpedoed the huge British liner Lusitania en route from New York to England in the Irish Sea. At the time, it was not known that the doomed ship carried in its hold weapons purchased in the U.S. The attack killed 1,200 of 2,000 passengers and crew, including 128 Americans. Newspaper headlines and many public officials condemned the attack as, quote, terrorism. Secretary of State William Jennings Bryan showed some sympathy for the German position. He argued that American civilians had no business traveling in a war zone and that selling any products to warring nations was provocative. President Wilson rejected Bryan's reasoning and threatened retaliation unless Germany pledged to stop submarine attacks on all civilian vessels and paid reparations for the sinking. When Germany failed to respond, Wilson sent a stiffer warning. Bryan resigned in protest against what he saw as the president's anti-German belligerence, but Wilson's pressure appeared to pay off. In mid-1915, Germany possessed only about 24 submarines, too few to stop all Atlantic shipping. Rather than risk war with the U.S., the German government agreed to halt most U-boat attacks on merchant and passenger ships. But with an eye to the future, the German Navy accelerated submarine construction. And during 1915 and 1916, U-boats several times attacked British and French passenger ships, some of which caused American deaths. But when Wilson threatened to sever diplomatic relations with Germany, a prelude to a declaration of war by the U.S., Germany again apologized and backed off. Meanwhile, the continued fighting in Europe took a ghastly human and economic toll. To feed, equip, and move their armies, the Allies borrowed millions of dollars from American banks and used the funds to buy vital raw materials. In 1914, the value of goods that Britain and France bought from the U.S. totaled about $754 million. By 1916, the value had more than tripled to $2.75 billion. With this influx of capital, the U.S. displaced Britain as the world's leading creditor nation, a rank the U.S. held until the 1980s. At the same time, because of the British blockade, Germany's transatlantic purchases dwindled from $345 million in 1914 to almost nothing by 1916. Even as U.S. loans flowed to the Allies, American banks loaned almost no money to Germany. Burgeoning trade deepened the connection between American business and political leaders and the Allies. It also enraged German leaders, who saw Wilson as a hypocrite for tacitly accepting the British naval blockade, which harmed civilians as well as soldiers, while condemning German naval warfare as piracy.